Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the North Fair Oaks Community Council meeting for the month of September. Mitzi, if we can get started with roll call, please. Here?
Here. Here. Here.
Thank you very much. As for public comment, anyone may speak up to 2 minutes on any topic not on the agenda tonight. If you want to do so, please fill out a speakers list, which would be available by the table at the entrance. And the council may not discuss or take action on items not on the agenda tonight. As item number 3, we have the swearing in of the new council members by Melissa Andrikopoulos. That's mine. It's just that belongs to.
Thank you, Chair Rodriguez. Good evening, council members. So I have the honor tonight of swearing in 2 new members to the North Fair Oaks Community Council. Jennifer Ruiz will be our new regular council member, and Francis Santos will be our new youth member. So I'm going to start with Jennifer, and I'll ask you to come up here with me, and we'll go ahead and administer the oath. So Jennifer, I'll ask you to raise your right hand and just go ahead and repeat after me, okay?
Okay.
So I state your name.
I, Jennifer Ruiz,
Do solemnly swear or affirm
do solemnly swear or affirm
that I will support and defend
that I will support and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of California
against all enemies,
against all enemies,
foreign and domestic,
foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith
that I will bear true faith
and allegiance
and allegiance
to the Constitution of the United States
to the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California,
and the Constitution to the State of California,
that I take this obligation freely
that I take this obligation freely
without any mental reservation
without any mental reservation
or purpose of evasion,
or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well
and that I will well
and faithfully
and faithfully
discharge the duties
discharge the duties
upon which I am about to enter.
upon which I'm about to enter.
Okay, congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll give it. And then I'll ask Francis Santos to go ahead and come up, please. Okay, so Councilmember Santos, we're going to do the same thing. If you could raise your right hand. I state your name.
I, Francis Santos,
Do solemnly swear or affirm
do solemnly swear and affirm
that I will support and defend
that I will support and defend
the Constitution of the United
the
States
Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California
and the Constitution of the State of California
against all enemies,
against all enemies,
foreign and domestic,
foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
that I will bear true faith and allegiance
to the Constitution of the United
to
States
the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of
and
California,
the Constitution of the State of California,
that I take this obligation freely,
that I will take faith on this obligation,
that I'll take
freely.
this obligation freely,
that I will take this
obligation freely,
obligation freely
without any mental reservation,
without mental
reservation,
reservation
or purpose of evasion,
or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well
and that I will well
and faithfully
and faithfully
discharge the duties
discharge the duties
upon which I am about to enter.
upon which I am about to enter.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much, Melissa. And welcome, Francis and Jennifer. Just a brief reminder for the public out there, there's still a vacant seat for the North Fair Oaks Community Council and one a youth member alternate council member. So thank you. And I realized that I mistakenly skipped two public comment. I got confused with the numbers here written down. So these are public comment that is not related to tonight's agenda. So I'm just going to take this public comment right now. Leticia Gonzalez. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, hello everyone, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak. My name is Leticia Gonzalez, and I am here to voice my support for a candidate, a very fine candidate who's running for the Redwood City School Board. That's Ms. Cecilia Marquez. I own property here in North Fair Oaks. I have family here in North Fair Oaks, and I've put my child through Redwood City Schools. I began my community service here in North Fair Oaks, here in this very community center, 27 years ago, and I am a Fair Oaks School alumni. So I have some deep roots here in this community. So I'm very invested in this community. I believe in Cecilia Marquez. She has years of experience on various community boards, advisory committee meetings. She has deep roots involved in schools. She raised 3 kids in Redwood City Schools, and she has been involved in numerous PTAs, PTOs, advisory committee meetings, and I can go on and so forth, but I only have 2 minutes. So I am here to voice support for her. I encourage everyone to please go and visit her website at www.ceciliamarquezrcsd.org. I encourage you to learn about the experience that she has, that she brings to this community, that she is offering this community. And I encourage you to please join me in November and voting for Cecilia Marquez for the school district. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It appears that we have the very same Cecilia Marquez. Is that correct for public comment? Please come to the podium, please.
Good evening, council members. I'm here to introduce myself. My name is Cecilia Marquez, and I am running for the school, Redwood City School Board, Area 5. Area 5 is a new seat. As some of you may know, the Redwood City School District went from an at-large to a by-trustee area, leaving the seat for the, that will actually, I'm sorry, I'm nervous, for me to actually be able to support my community. As Leticia mentioned, I've been involved with the Redwood City School District and Sequoia Union High School District. I have 3 kids. I'm a mother of 3 kids. 2 are in college now, and I currently have 1 in elementary. I've lived in Redwood City for the last 31 years and in Area 5 for the last 20 years. I've been part of several parent-teacher associations. My career started at adult school for the Sequoia Union High School District 21 years ago. I am currently at the district office as a senior administrative secretary for the Assistant Superintendent of Administrative Services for the Sequoia Union High School District. My primary role for Redwood City would be to empower families by allowing them to give them the tools and the resources that they need so that they can help their kids succeed in school. I believe that having them and teaching them young would then help them become better citizens. So I thought it was a good opportunity for me to introduce myself so that you guys can know, if elected, I will try my best to do everything that I could possibly can to support the community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much and good luck. We will proceed with item number 4, presentation regarding sea level rise and San Mateo County Community Resilience Grant. A presentation by Mr. Derek Oyang, from the Stanford University Sustainable Urban Systems Initiative.
Thank you. Thank you, Everardo. 20 minutes? You got? Okay. Council, my name is Derek O. Yang. I'm a lecturer at Stanford University. I got 2 degrees at the bachelor's level there, a master's degree there as well, and I'm currently a lecturer there, have been for about 3 years now. And I'm here today to introduce some of the work we've done at the Sustainable Urban Systems graduate program that pertains to the North Fair Oaks community, and in a specific way, hopefully will lead to collaboration, both with the council and nonprofit organizations and other stakeholders in the community. And I'll present that briefly today. 3 quick key takeaways I'll introduce right up front. Based on our analysis, the North Fair Oaks properties are not at significant direct risk, which is to say building damage from coastal flooding. And I want to immediately distinguish that from other forms of flooding, like upstream rivering flooding, but may face significant indirect risks through network effects such as transportation disruption and the disproportionate impacts that may come to low-income neighborhoods. So that's a key takeaway from the kind of work we did in the course. Takeaway number 2 is that our urban systems program at the graduate level is actively looking for ways to support and serve local communities. And we have identified some stakeholders in this community that are interested in that collaboration, and we hope to make progress on issues like sea level rise, risk mitigation, but potentially many other types of urban systems issues that stakeholders in the community would like to address. And lastly, in a very specific way, we have an opportunity like that that we're waiting to hear about. San Mateo County's Office of Sustainability put out a grant program proposal for up to $200,000, but $90,000 per entry for sea level rise planning, assessment, and implementation work in the local community in the county, money that would be administered in the 2019 fiscal year. We put together a team that included El Concilio, Siena Youth Center, representatives from the community council here, and our graduate program at Stanford, and we submitted a proposal together for $90,000, and we expect to hear about that, at least the first round of interviews in October. So a little bit about our urban risk framework, which led to that first key takeaway. At Stanford, we think about risk as a relationship between hazards, exposure, and vulnerability to produce an economic or otherwise risk. In terms of hazard, this could be anything. This could be earthquakes, wildfire, heat waves, but for our specific purposes, we focused on sea level rise-based coastal flooding. Coastal flooding has 2 distinct components. There's a base amount of sea level rise that may happen based on climate change in the next decades. And then there's just the incidences of flooding that are happening today, the 100-year flood, the 500-year floods through traditional storm patterns. And what's difficult to understand is in the future how there will be combinations of sea level rise and then flood events, storm events. Of course, as sea level rise increases, then the 100-year event gets more and more severe because it's starting from a higher point. Now, what matters about those hazards is that they are then interacting with assets that matter to us, buildings, infrastructure, et cetera. For our purposes, we focused particularly on direct property damage in our analysis, at least to begin with. And so here I'm showing all the building footprints with some color coding to refer to land use type in areas that include North Fair Oaks. Here I'm showing through industry construction reports the average dollars per square foot of market value of different types of buildings, like residential versus hotel versus commercial. And so combining our knowledge of the size of buildings and their types with these rough estimates of market value, this now shows what we estimate as potential replacement value if a building is damaged, which is to say that if your first floor gets flooded and you have to redo the carpet and the flooring, then you can think about that as some percentage of this total potential replacement value per building. Now, what does that actually mean in terms of a calculation? There's got to be some relationship between the hazard and the exposure, and that's what we call vulnerability. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, as it does its assessment work, is finding out what damage happened in previous events and using that to predict what kind of damage may happen in future events. FEMA does this too. These are relationships in the colors shown between, on the x-axis, some potential amount of flood depth. Here it's in feet from 0 to 10. And in the y-axis, from 0 to 100%, the amount of damage expected to a building. And that percentage is replacement value percentage. So the green line is referring to industrial buildings, which by their nature, they're large, they're concrete floors, there's not a lot necessarily on the ground in terms of structure. Then as flood depth increases, its percent experienced or expected damage isn't as significant as, say, in orange, single-family homes, where you might have wood and other types of important structure that's exposed to flooding on the first floor. And then in blue, the most vulnerable type of structure, mobile homes. And this is all based on data you can get from past events, and that data is not necessarily reliable enough for the kind of work we need to do. So all that then in a computational model in terms of our work and the work of many engineering consultants produces estimates of economic risk. So as a quick interlude on just how important risk is as a difficult concept, which is part of what we think matters in terms of educating the public in places like North Fair Oaks. This is an example I actually just presented to students today in class of how likely is a 100-year flood in the next 100 years. This is just a math and statistics problem. And I'm going to walk through it as quickly as I can in terms of how you actually answer this question. The first question you should ask is, what is the likelihood that no 100-year flood happens in 1 year? Well, if the 100-year flood event is a 1% chance event, then the probability of it not happening is 99%. Now, what is the likelihood that no 100-year flood happens in 2 years in a row? Just like you're flipping a coin and you're trying to get two heads, you got to multiply those probabilities. Here we have to multiply 99% times 99%, so that the chance that there's no 100-year flood in 2 years in a row is around 98%. Now that's not much less, but that should be the same logic for asking, what is the chance of no 100-year flood 100 years in a row? That means you have to take 99% and multiply it by itself 100 times. That actually produces 36%. Now that's not the answer we want. We wanted to ask, how likely is a 100-year flood? It should just be the 1 minus that. So any other alternative besides no 100-year flood is 1 or more 100-year floods. And this is usually a surprising number to people because they may have assumed that the chance of a 100-year flood in the next 100 years, 1%. It's actually 63%, which is to say we often underestimate the risk of these types of events and dangers generally when it comes to climate change and risk, which may mean that we're not investing adequately and preparing adequately for these events. Now, San Mateo County did a large vulnerability assessment, which happened over the course of a few years, but was most recently finalized in March of this year. They projected a lot of risks throughout the county, but particularly for North Fair Oaks, there was not that much direct risk. They show their work through these 3 flooding scenarios. The baseline scenario, and hope that's why I just gave that example, refers to a 1% annual chance storm in current conditions, no sea level rise. And that's in the blue column here. And actually they said there's absolutely no asset in North Fair Oaks that experiences that event, which we actually agree with in our work. But in their midline scenario, their mid-level scenario in orange, that is in a future in which there is 3.3 feet of sea level rise in the bay, and then you have that kind of event, then they are projecting some damage. And we went first to see if we could replicate and verify these results in our work. So I'm showing you now the buildings in North Fair Oaks as an example, and I'm now going to start to show floods. I also want to make it clear that all of this is predictive models. This isn't real events that will happen. You have to understand that these flood maps come from scientific models that are predictions of the future but aren't actually the future. But here we're seeing that 0-foot sea level rise, 100-year flood event. It's just getting close to some of the, this is roughly at the top where the Stanford Medical Center is. This is that mid-level scenario that the county referred to, 3.3 feet of sea level rise. So let's just imagine that could happen 50 years, 100 years from now. And then you have a 100-year event. And as you can see, most of North Fair Oaks is not affected in this event or this model of this event. But there are lots of commercial businesses right at the top there. And of course, keep in mind that there are many other buildings that are being flooded outside of North Fair Oaks, Friendly Acres, et cetera, in this event. Now, I wanted to show you a more extreme event here, but this is a very unlikely event anytime soon, anytime in the next 100 years. This is 16 feet of sea level rise, and then you have a 100-year flood. And now we're seeing that it's crossing El Camino at places. It's hitting where we are right now. Of course, this would be a catastrophic event. But we're not going to see 16 feet of sea level rise anytime soon. So there are big events with very low probability. There are small events with higher probability. One of the important ideas is average loss, to take all of these combined together. And you should think of that as kind of like insurance. You don't know exactly when some event may occur that you have to pay for. That's why we pay a small amount every year just to save up for that. And so when we calculate average annual loss, it's as if we are going to the year 2050 or going to the year 2100 and looking back at all the different events that did in fact happen. Some years there were no events at all, no damage at all. Some years you had the big damage. But if you then just divided that all equally year by year, then that's what you roughly did end up having to pay year by year to deal with those costs. That's what we're calling average annualized loss. You calculate that with some mathematical formulas like the one I had shared. So what I'm showing you now is the same map, but now color refers to that average annual loss. What's actually happening behind the scenes are there are dozens and dozens of different individual flood events that we're now aggregating together based on their individual probabilities of happening. Which is to say, this is more representative of the overall expected risk for North Fair Oaks across any number of potential sea level rise scenarios and flood scenarios between now and 2100. And actually, in this aggregate sense, still, most of North Fair Oaks is unaffected. The commercial sector does face risk, but when you compare it to other cities, as I'll show you in a bit, it is really negligible. And that is not our major concern in terms of the many number of weather-related, climate-related risks that North Fair Oaks can face. Things like heat intensity, riverine flooding, et cetera. I think, although we haven't measured it directly, it'll be clear later in this presentation why we're focusing so much on coastal flooding at all. But this is a method by which we are understanding risk in urban areas. This is just zoomed in a little bit more on that commercial sector at the top. But again, this is not intending to mean that any one of these individual buildings is going to experience the dollar damage we're projecting here. By the way, in red, we're looking at a range from $0 per year to $3,000 to $5,000 per year. So what we are implying in this model is that individual buildings, although they're not actually paying $3,000 to $5,000 per year, but over the course of many decades of people living in these buildings and working in these buildings, it would be as if they did in fact have to pay that much per year in repair costs. And that's, of course, a very difficult idea to think about when you don't experience those floods every year. But this is just like insurance. You're paying a premium every year because those events could happen. And maybe we should have insurance to this degree for floods in many, many places that don't currently have flood insurance. Okay, just to show you why, from perspective, we're dealing with many, many bigger issues in the county. Redwood City itself actually experiences an average annualized loss overall as a city of greater than $100 million per year. And it's by far the largest in our analysis. And we think that's actually mainly because of Oracle headquarters and a lot of other smaller commercial establishments that are near the bay and Redwood Shores. Commercial property, as you can imagine, has a larger replacement value attached to it, but not necessarily a greater importance to community vulnerability. Overall, in San Mateo County, we are looking at a combination of structure and content losses, an estimate of $400 million per year. That is basically people repairing damage to buildings, which now we're talking about is a significant number, especially if you're ignoring it at the moment. Now, that was all direct damage. What we discovered as students engaging with stakeholders throughout San Mateo County and in our own research work is that that's not even necessarily the big problem. there may be a much bigger problem under the tip of the iceberg, which is after direct damage happens, what happens when the power goes down, when the wastewater treatment plants stop working, when clogging on the networks prevent people from going to work. And those are more network effects which are harder to analyze, but we realize should be better understood if we're truly going to adequately prepare for the risks of something like flooding. So we set out to do some work in that area, and it's an ongoing process and something we can do more of in a community like North Fair Oaks. Just as an example of why that's so important to think of at the systems level, as I had showed before, North Fair Oaks buildings don't experience a lot of direct damage, but here I'm showing, zoomed out to the South Bay Peninsula scale, in yellow, where North Fair Oaks workers live. These are people who don't live in North Fair Oaks but work in North Fair Oaks, and their locations are roughly estimated in yellow. In red are where North Fair Oaks residents work. So they live in North Fair Oaks, but every day they go out and work somewhere else. This is based on census information. So the buildings in North Fair Oaks may not be damaged, but if the place you go work or where you came from to come to work in North Fair Oaks gets flooded, or the route on the way, then you've got that other type of network effect. And that's going to affect your life and potentially the economy in North Fair Oaks. And of course, this is true all across the Bay Area in a really messy and tangled way. So our network analysis in this world is quite complicated when it comes to the computations, but effectively we're asking for every resident in the Bay Area in a point A to point B fashion for work. Here's an example of someone from Stanford going to Berkeley. They may have a preferred route over the Martin Bridge, but in a flood event, they may have to instead swing around the South Bay through 237. And just imagine when a flood event hits in peak hour, rush hour traffic, how many of these kinds of detours may be happening and what that means to the economy. And we have estimated that as well as preliminary results for the Bay Area total. That is on the same order of magnitude. That's an additional $200 million on top of the hundreds of millions we've already estimated of direct damage, and that exists for San Mateo County as well. Another type of under the tip of the iceberg kind of thinking is here, by the way, was the breakdown of direct damage by type of building. On the left is a pie chart, which is total numbers of buildings, and by far the greatest in green of potentially damaged buildings are residential buildings. However, when you look on the right side, this is total value of that property, and green is no longer the biggest, it's blue, and blue is commercial property. So what this is saying is that when, in terms of coastal flood risk, more individual residential buildings are threatened, but the greatest economic damage would be to the Silicon Valley kinds of corporations that exist close to the Bay, like Facebook, Google, et cetera. And when it comes to businesses in particular, when that direct building gets damaged, there are many other types of indirect losses. There could be operational disruption of that business. It can't continue to run as a restaurant or a retail store the next day, maybe for months. There may be supply chain disruption, and as I mentioned before, there may be employee commute disruption, all of which are compounded kinds of economic risks and social risks. And this is just showing all the businesses in the San Mateo County that are within that floodable area over the course of the next few decades. And then, of course, they have annual revenue, annual sales attached to them. So we did our attempt at estimating the risk to the commercial sector. There's $200 million expected of commercial direct damage risk. That was basically the first type of analysis. But you can't forget that there is up to $76 million of operational disruption or more, and then $42 million of commute disruption, which is just to say it's so important to think about the bigger picture of network effects in floods, or else you're underestimating the kind of risks that communities face. Okay, last quick section here. We also cared a lot about social equity in this work, and that came out of the interests of the students and what we were hearing from stakeholders throughout the county. And I think about equity as a really sinister problem here, because just as a thought experiment, when you have any kind of population, there's a proportion that is more resilient and a proportion that is more vulnerable. It's always the case. So when that community experiences a shock, by definition, a resilient portion of the community can fare it better. They will experience fewer losses associated with that shock, whereas the vulnerable portion of the population will experience that shock more intensely and suffer more losses. What that is suggesting is that disasters and shocks will just increase inequality by definition in communities where there are some resilient and some vulnerable. So resilience and equity are really just two sides of the same coin. sometimes the key to reducing inequity is to reduce vulnerability in your community to future events that will exacerbate that inequality. So we wanted to understand this better, and it led to a really interesting set of projects in our work. There are, interestingly, two separate types of questions here. One is, are flood damages distributed equitably across different demographic groups, low income versus high income, white versus non-white communities in our neighborhoods? And then, if a low income person is experiencing the same amount of damage than a higher income person, are they experiencing actually the same amount of loss? And those are actually distinct questions. Let me go to the first one first. These are the types of demographic metrics of interest that counties and the regional governments have here in the Bay Area. And here's an example of cities in San Mateo County, just total number of people in the population of each city that we are estimating will experience damage, but we're also breaking it down by English proficiency. And yellow here is speaking not well or not at all in terms of the most recent census. Here is another view of the same information. We're looking at a total 700,000 or so people in San Mateo County, and their breakdown between speaking English well in blue, all the way to not speaking very well in orange. And then there's actually just a small percentage of people we're estimating would experience significant damage, that average annualized loss. We got interested in viewing this same information this way, in which we've spread those to be percent-based and to look at the difference in distribution between the existing overall population demographics and the demographics of that population that was in fact experiencing damage. And if there's any difference between these two, then that implies that some groups are experiencing more damage than we would expect in a fair world, and other groups are experiencing less. In this case, actually, in orange, you see that's getting bigger on the lower row. That is essentially saying that in San Mateo County, non-English speaking households are more likely to experience flood damage than we would expect in a fair world. And that is because there are more households that are non-English speaking or English as a first language within flood zones. Okay? The same idea here is shown for income. All of these were hypotheses until we looked at the data ourselves. And when we spread this out, there is a small effect for income as well. Again, how to read this graph is that in San Mateo County, low-income households are more likely to experience flood damage than we would expect in a fair world. Okay? And this may imply all kinds of potential ways to address that in terms of risk preparedness, policy, et cetera. Okay. Last quick slide here in terms of our analysis work, and I'll get to my conclusions. The other type of equity issue is whether low-income versus high-income households just experience the damage of floods differently. Whether or not they're more disproportionately exposed, they may also just experience a flood event in a more intense and difficult way. This is showing across different income deciles that average annualized loss per household. And what this is showing is that across the board, we're looking at $2,000 to $4,000 per year, in that sense of that's what you're actually, in a sense, paying every year for the flood damages you will one day experience. And for low-income households, of course, that is a serious amount of money to be talking about. And we're showing that explicitly in this graph now. We've taken that orange and flipped it upside down. In blue is this idea of discretionary income. That's your income subtracting out the necessary payments you have to make: housing, healthcare, food, transportation, et cetera. So this is, in theory, what you then can save on a year-to-year basis. In places like the Bay Area and nationwide, the lowest deciles of our society actually have negative discretionary income. That implies they're on welfare, or they're sacrificing other types of important necessary payments already. And now on top of that, we're deducting that $2,000 to $4,000 per year. That's important because there are existing vulnerable parts of our societies that are now just going to be even more at risk of displacement, homelessness, quality of life impacts. But if you see that third decile, there may be entire groups of households that are at a tipping point where they would have been fine without climate change as a risk. But now, over that next few decades, we're going to see these communities and households as the most stressed from issues like flooding. And again, this will manifest itself in many kinds of ways for many types of risks. But the idea is to identify these tipping points in these most vulnerable at-risk communities. So what, in fact, did we end up doing as a group? As students at Stanford, we went out engaged with local public, private sector, community sector stakeholders throughout the Bay to better understand these issues and to reach those results we shared. And that was an incredible learning experience for students to go out and actually immerse themselves in communities, speak to residents and businesses and decision makers to understand how to actually think about risk and communicate risk for this type of work. And that did ultimately reach public events and presentations directly to government stakeholders in San Mateo County. And we presented a report directly to San Mateo County, which is available on our website, sus.stanford.edu. So based on that work, just a few months ago, actually, since I've known Everardo, who also works at Stanford, we wanted to see how we can deepen that work this next year by focusing in on a specific community. And San Mateo County's Office of Sustainability, in fact, was putting out money to enable cities and organizations to do that work, to assess, plan, and implement sea level rise improvements, mitigations in communities in San Mateo County. So we figured this is a great opportunity to bring Stanford into service of local community groups, nonprofits, and in particular to find those vulnerable communities that were identified in our analysis. And with the help of organizations, El Concilio, Siena Youth Center, and the council, we scoped out an initial proposal for what we call the North Fair Oaks Community Resilience Program, which is something that would be designed and then carried out as part of this first years of funding. And the high-level goals of that program would be, one, to raise awareness at the individual level for youth, households, businesses about these sea level rise risks, both direct and indirect. Two, to build real preparedness at the individual level, whether that means improvements to your home, emergency kits, etc. Number three, community networks similar to the community emergency response teams that exist in other cities in the county and in the US that deal with more community level preparedness. And number four, civic education and participation in resilience planning and policy, which is of course a big part of what the Community Council is here to do in this community. So, and that line highlighted at the top, essentially our thesis is what we want to do with this money that's been made available is we would try to empower the most vulnerable youth, working class families, and small businesses anywhere in San Mateo County, not just North Fair Oaks, to transform into beacons of local resilience. And why not start in a place like North Fair Oaks? That can be the hub of that kind of leadership that then propagates out to the rest of San Mateo County. So just as a summary, the key takeaways of this presentation were that risk analysis has already been done by Stanford in San Mateo County and has shown preliminarily that there isn't significant direct risk of building damage in North Fair Oaks, but all kinds of potential network effects, which we want to better understand in our next steps of further work. Two, we've identified interest from students and ourselves to work specifically with North Fair Oaks stakeholders and are seeking out opportunities to do that. And number three, finally, there has been such an opportunity. We've submitted a grant proposal for $90,000 in partnership with these community groups, and we will hear about that in October, and knock on wood that there's some ability to catalyze this type of engagement with communities in North Fair Oaks. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Derek. If council members have any questions for Derek, please go ahead and ask them.
Yeah, through the chair.
Right.
So the graphs that you showed on the damage, the damage, yeah, I think it was on the low income levels. Do you, what is that based on though, Derek? Is that,
Yeah, I can answer that.
Is that primarily because of lack of information, do you think? I'm trying to understand where, what that piece is based on.
When you say piece, do you mean, in this case, the blue or the orange? The orange being our estimated flood damages.
Estimated,
Yes.
right. But specifically low income.
Yes.
And is it, and I'm just off the top of my head, I'm thinking lack of information, lack of prevention tools. So it's not really then about the actual structures. Am I correct in that?
No, the differences you see in this particular graph just have to do with location. Because in our model, residential buildings are residential buildings. And if you are seeing greater damage for low-income households, that is because there are more low-income households close to the bay where they're experiencing higher floods. That relates actually back to this graph, which was implying that you had low-income communities disproportionately exposed, which is also just to say that they're going to experience higher floodwaters when there's a flood event, which is why you see some differences. Now, these differences aren't necessarily large compared across the income deciles. It's much more important to think about this in relationship to what you have to actually pay, where that difference really starts to show up. For high-income households, of course, this is a drop in the bucket in terms of flood damages, and they likely have great insurance for that. So it occurred to us as a much more important way to think about flood damage. It's not an absolute damage that matters. It's damage in relation to your ability to recuperate from that. Yes.
Any other questions? I'm wondering, Derek, how do you envision that if funding is provided by this grant, how do you envision doing the work or subdividing, some of the tasks?
First, I didn't intentionally show a lot of those details, although you and I have seen the full grant proposal, because A, that proposal hasn't been accepted yet, but B, part of the goal of the first step of that process was to bring a larger group of constituents and stakeholders together to refine exactly what the right way to use that money is, because we only got enough thinking on that to be able to submit it to review. It's also, from my perspective, less important what Stanford thinks here and what communities have as existing goals and assets. That being said, in terms of the potential division of work, we think that Stanford's ability to do this type of analysis sets the stage for just better understanding risk. And then it's a question of how do you communicate that risk and act on that risk. And we can't do that step alone. So one of the big things we've already proposed in the proposal is to take the kind of work that's done here and then over the summer of 2019 to work with local organizations like Siena Youth Center, El Concilio, the Sequoia Adult School, to translate that into curriculum and training that is specific to specific groups like households, businesses, youth. And each of those will understand and care about specific parts of this work in different ways and then can act on it in different ways. So there is a curriculum development portion of our work that then Stanford students would be working closely with stakeholders on. And then there are many other potential ways we can think about resilience campaigns, plans, programs, trainings, emergency drills that then get carried out as part of what we've called the North Fair Oaks Community Resilience Program. But we really see that as ultimately a co-designed participatory effort, which this funding is just meant to help us get together and do that design work.
Through the chair, when I first had received information on this, I thought floods. We don't have floods, right?
Yes.
The only floods I remember are over there off of 5th and Hoover in that area, and some on El Camino. But I think it's critical that we do get this information out to our residents, our businesses, our students, because it's really not about getting a 100-year flood. It's really that if something does happen in the surrounding areas, it's the impact on our community. And there's nothing better, and you can say that for pretty much any ill in our community, is to be prepared and have preventative tools in place that the community can use. And plus, I think it brings a sense of not just knowledge and information, but a sense of safety and security. And I think whenever we can bring that into the community, I think it's a good thing. So I'm really actually very excited about this program. I love the word resilience. I mean, that is a very strong word of empowering and being able to bounce back in case something does happen. Maybe not directly on the community, but our neighbors in our surrounding areas. So I think it's really important, and I think it's a great program, and I thank you very much for giving the presentation.
Thank you. If I may just give two last comments there, Councilmember Lopez. Thanks for that, because it reminded me of something I wanted to emphasize. One is that sea level rise is the focus because it's been a political focus of Supervisor Pine and other leaders in San Mateo County. I see it really as the start of a larger culture and conversation around resilience that would then trickle down and across to many, many other types of hazards that our communities will be facing and facing more. Wildfires, as they've been in the news, heat intensity, upstream flooding as opposed to downstream flooding, and then earthquakes. And if anything, this is just a first chapter in many, many other types of resilience projects we can do in partnership with local communities. The last point I want to make is, just as I've been trying to present to you today the idea that we are underestimating the risk associated with having vulnerable communities, the opposite is also true. We are likely underestimating how powerful it can be to create a culture of resilience in communities and to let that be its own force for change across all aspects of well-being and quality of life in communities, especially those that have so far been underserved and maybe disadvantaged in different ways. And so what we're really trying to do here is flip the narrative that would the county have expected North Fair Oaks to become the leader around resilience? I think actually is inevitably what must happen for communities like North Fair Oaks to change the narrative around vulnerability and resilience.
And I'd like to add, in addition to what Councilmember Lopez said about this project, that for us, North Fair Oaks, it is a win-win situation because this program, while it promotes and encourages education and safety prevention, at the same time, the fact that that many North Fair Oaks organizations are collaborating, you know, like the Siena Youth Center with El Concilio and the adult school, and potentially some of the merchants here in North Fair Oaks, that is already a great thing for our community to have many entities collaborating, you know, and getting together, talking about these brand new issues that may bring a lot of damage and destruction caused by climate change. So very happy to participate in this project. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for letting me have the time today.
Of course. If there's any public comment about this issue, it is welcome. Otherwise, we will go on to item number 5, which is a presentation regarding El Camino Real and Selby Lane intersection improvements. Presentation by Mr. Michael Kashiwagi, who's the Chief Operations Officer for Interest Consulting Group.
Good evening. Yes, my name is Mike Kashiwagi, and I'm engineering contract engineering staff for the town of Atherton. Here this evening, sharing information regarding some engineering studies that's been done at the intersection of Selby and El Camino Real for the last 3 or 4 years. And the PowerPoint that I'm going to be sharing with you this evening is the same PowerPoint that was shared at a community meeting, our last community meeting on the subject back in December of 2017. One of the things, before I get started, I really want to emphasize is that although for the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a lot of discussions between Caltrans, the town of Atherton, and San Mateo County, a fair amount of engineering analysis of the intersection, which has been reviewed by Caltrans, San Mateo County, and the town of Atherton. There currently is no project being planned. Through the analysis, we've identified some improvements that that we feel can be supported, but at this point there is no project. So, in case anyone's wondering whether or not there's actually a project being designed at this point. So the reason for this work was, and the reason why Caltrans, San Mateo County, and the town of Atherton started these discussions is really to try to identify ways to improve safety for pedestrians, bicyclists, and vehicles at that very busy intersection. So this slide here, it kind of provides a chronology of kind of the journey we've been on over the last 3 or 4 years as far as the work that's being done. And for the town of Atherton, the journey started back in December of 2014 when Caltrans came to City Council, basically sharing information about accident history at Selby ECR, and informing the council that over the last 10 years, and it was a period of 2002 to 2011, where they identified 50 reported accidents at that intersection. All the accidents were vehicular, so in other words, there were no reported pedestrian accidents, and there were no reported bicycle accidents. And in looking at all the vehicular accidents, the primary collision factor, the reason why these were happening was basically a failure to yield and improper turns. And approximately half of the accidents were cars being broadsided, which is of concern because those are the types of accidents where more and more major injuries typically occur. So as a result of all this, Caltrans reported to the town council that their recommendation was to signalize the intersection. Due to concerns raised by Atherton residents regarding the installation of a traffic signal, the City Council directed staff to investigate other non-signalized alternatives to improve intersection safety and operations. So as a result of that, in April of 2015, the town staff engaged staff from San Mateo County and Caltrans to start discussing a variety of alternatives to improve the safety and operations of Selby ECR. The purpose of these discussions wasn't to necessarily come up with solutions, but the purpose was to try to identify conceptual other concepts other than a signal, which would improve the intersection, and this meant identifying alternatives which were sensitive and respectful of neighborhood traffic concerns, as well as alternatives which preserved the capacity and operations of El Camino Real. And the reason why there's 3 agencies involved is this is somewhat of a unique intersection because that intersection is under jurisdictional control of Caltrans, San Mateo County, and the town of Atherton. Of course, the main line of El Camino Real is Caltrans. The east side of El Camino Selby is San Mateo County, and the west side Selby is the town of Atherton. So that's why we wanted to engage all 3 agencies because it was going to be important that from an engineering staff perspective that everyone would be in agreement and would be able to support some of the alternatives that were going to be developed. So once we identified, after meeting for probably 3 or 4 times, we came up with 5 different alternatives that, again, all 3 agencies can support, and these were all non-signalized alternatives. Once we got to that point, then the town of Atherton hosted our first community meeting. That was held in February of 2016. And the purpose of that meeting was not to present any solutions to the public. It was really to share with the public some conceptual alternatives that the 3 agencies had come up with. And the other purpose was to not only share this information, but also to get feedback and input from the residents who were there. These meetings were broadly advertised to both residents in the town of Atherton, San Mateo County, and Redwood City, because Redwood City is right there too, and whatever happened at this intersection could potentially affect residents in Redwood City as well. At this community meeting, after presenting all the alternatives, one of the things we did was we asked all the participants there to kind of show their support or non-support of the different alternatives, and we did that by asking them to, kind of place red dots and green dots on alternatives that they liked and didn't like. And because what we wanted to do there was we wanted to try to narrow from 5 alternatives to a lower number of alternatives, which we would then want to do more engineering operational analysis, which is something that Caltrans required us to do. So as a result of that, we were able to narrow down the alternatives from 5 alternatives down to 2. And the 2 alternatives that got the most support from the residents at that meeting, and I want to point out that this was not anything scientific. It was basically, I think at that first meeting we had about 30 residents in total. So it was basically from those 30 residents who were there, getting feedback from them. But the 2 alternatives that received the most support was a traffic signal. And the other one was an alternative which basically, through the construction of median islands, restricted the amount of movements that would be possible at the intersection. Once we came up with those 2 alternatives, then one of the requirements of Caltrans was they wanted more engineering analysis to be done to analyze and to identify any operational impacts either one of these 2 alternatives would have on El Camino Real. So the town of Atherton funded additional engineering analysis for that. A report was developed and submitted to Caltrans for review. And in May of 2017, the town received comments from Caltrans, and really they're relatively minor. Basically the comments from Caltrans was that neither one of the alternatives they felt posed significant impacts to the operations of El Camino Real. Each one did, but they were all things that could be addressed as part of the engineering of whatever the final design would be. So as a result of that, basically Caltrans said that they can support either one. However, they also indicated that the signalized intersection was their preferred alternative because they believed it's a better solution to reduce vehicle collisions and to provide a safer crossing of El Camino Real for pedestrians and bicyclists. And, from an engineering standpoint, that is true. I mean, as an engineer, I would agree that the traffic signal is the best engineering solution. However, because of beyond engineering, there's also the neighborhood concerns. As a result of that, San Mateo County technical staff, they preferred the non-signalized solution at that intersection, and also the town of Atherton technical staff, we also preferred the non-signalized solution as well. So once we got to that point, we wanted to have another community meeting to basically share the results of this operational analysis with the community to, again, get to inform and to get feedback. That meeting occurred in October of 2017. And we also had the town hosted a third meeting in December of 2013. But the reason for that third meeting really was we had a snafu in our outreach, sending out the mailers for the October meeting. So the city council wanted us to basically do a redo of the same meeting in December. So that's why that was a primary purpose for the December 2017 meeting. The feedback that we did receive was very mixed, and there was definitely no consensus of a preferred alternative by community members that attended these meetings. And really, that really wasn't a big surprise, since resident preference is largely based upon how they personally use and access that intersection, and their beliefs regarding how any changes to that intersection will impact traffic patterns on their streets. So, that's why there really wasn't any consensus from a community standpoint of a preferred alternative. So what this slide shows is, really what one of the challenges are. And for all of you who have used that intersection, one of the challenges is that, well, the first thing is that there's a lot of cars that travel down El Camino Real on a daily basis. And in fact, in that section, it's in excess of 37,000 cars a day, going at speeds of 35 or 40 to 45 miles per hour. And as a result of that, if you were a person trying to turn either left in any direction at that intersection, it's very difficult to find a gap. And really one of the issues now is all the yellow arrows there. Those are all the possible movements that occur, and currently they're unregulated, right? Because there's no stop signs and there's no traffic signals. So at this, and then all the red, that's also pedestrians and bicyclists who are trying to cross those streets at the same time. So that's really the challenge, is that there's a lot of movements trying to cross a very busy street, and it's currently unregulated. One of the things that we heard at our November 2017 meeting was we kept on talking about the accidents, the 50 accidents from Caltrans. And again, those were from the period of 2002 to 2011. So one of the things we heard clearly from the residents was, this is 2017. This is old information. Why don't you guys get us some recent, some more recent information? So between our October 2017 meeting and our December 2017 meeting, the Town of Atherton Police Department and Public Works staff went through all of the accident records of that intersection. And what we found is that rather than 50 accidents over a 10-year period, when we take a look at the 10-year period of basically from November 2008 to November 2017, which is, again, a 10-year period, what we found was that we had 69 total accidents at that intersection. 63 were vehicular. There were 6 accidents involving bicycles, no accidents involving pedestrians. 45% were rear-end collisions, 33% broadside collisions, and 30% resulted in injuries, and there was actually 1 fatality. The fact that the accidents has increased, went from 50 to 69, it's not surprising, because over that same period of time, traffic volumes along El Camino Real, I'm sure, increased quite a bit. So with increasing traffic on El Camino Real, the probability of more accidents is going to be higher. When we took a look at those accidents, what this diagram shows is kind of where and how those accidents occurred. And so the arrows kind of show the direction of the accidents. The number shows the number of those types of accidents. And so when we took a look at all these accidents, what we pretty much concluded was all of these accidents were as a result of cars turning. I mean, obviously, the ones where there's turning arrows and there's a number, but even the ones where, like, there's a 14 down on the bottom left here and a 9 where there's an arrow going straight, well, that means that a car was rear-ended. But what we believe is, in all probability, the reason why there was a rear-end collision is a car had to stop because of a left-turning car in front of them. So, what we've got from this action history is that, again, kind of confirmed that all of these accidents are a result of vehicles trying to turn. Again, this is the same diagram, and really the reasons for these accidents: poor visibility, lack of gaps in traffic as a result of the high traffic volume and the speeds of the cars. And, because all these movements are unregulated, it's really unclear who has the right of way. So I wanted to go through just kind of quickly I talked about the options that we studied. So of course the option is just the traffic signal. And one of the benefits or the benefit of this option is, again, it regulates all movements, right? That's what traffic signals do. And also the signalized crossing provides a more safe crossing for bicyclists and pedestrians because, again, signals stop cars. But one of the downsides of a traffic signal is that it could create some diversion of cars and increase the number of cars on, in this case, Selby Lane, of cars who want to go to Selby Lane because they know there's a signal there and they can safely make a left turn onto El Camino Real. And that's why residents, whether or not you're a resident in San Mateo County on Selby or a resident in the town of Atherton on Selby, that is really why residents on that street have concerns about traffic signals. And then I also talked about the other alternative was constructing medians in the roadway. And there's actually two versions of this. And really, when you take a look at these medians, if you recall that graph there showing all the different types of movements in yellow that can occur, well, by constructing that median, really, there's only left-turning cars, right? It eliminates the possibility of a lot of those other yellow lines. And then, so this alternative here, it basically doesn't allow any left turns in or out of Selby, with the exception of the left turn in from El Camino Real down to Selby Lane. And the reason why this alternative was looked at is because when you take a look at the number of cars on a daily basis that turn from, that are going, I guess that would be southbound El Camino to westbound Selby, which is coming into Atherton, that volume is much greater than cars who are going southbound on El Camino, turning left eastbound onto Selby in the county. And that's primarily because on the Atherton side, there's an elementary school. So there's a lot of traffic in the morning, parents dropping off their kids, and in the afternoon picking up their kids. On the San Mateo County side, it's just really kind of a smaller residential area, so there really isn't as much demand. But because San Mateo County staff expressed concerns that they didn't want to eliminate that left into the county portion of Selby, this is the other alternative where, again, it's very similar. The only difference is that it allows a left-hand turn into the eastern side of Selby Lane. And actually, and this is the alternative that basically would be supported by all three agencies at the technical staff level. None of these have gone to the policymakers, but from a technical staff standpoint, this is an alternative that Caltrans says it could live with. This is the preferred alternative of San Mateo County staff, and in the town of Atherton, we certainly can support this alternative as well. We already talked about that a little bit. So I mentioned that in November of 2017, Town of Atherton Police Department and their engineering staff went through and analyzed all the traffic accidents. At the same time, what we also wanted to do was take a look at bike ped accidents. And in this case, rather than just focusing on the one intersection of Selby and ECR, we wanted to take more of a look at more of a segment and to take a look at accidents in more of that segment. So we actually took a look at accidents, bike and ped accidents on El Camino Real from Selby all the way down to Stockbridge. So that included 4 different intersections, Selby, 5th Avenue, Amherst, and Stockbridge. And what we found is that during that 10-year period, there were a total of 28 accidents and one fatality. And how that breaks out by each one of the intersections. At Selby, there were 6 bike accidents. At 5th Avenue, there were 5 bike and 9 pedestrian accidents. At Amherst, there was 1 bike accident. And at Stockbridge, there was 5 bike and 2 pedestrian accidents. So that concludes my presentation, and but I'd be very happy to answer any questions that the council has.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Kashiwagi. If council members have any questions, please go ahead.
I'm sorry, you started your presentation by saying there's no, maybe I didn't hear you because I got the AC. There's no program, there's no project?
Correct.
What does that mean?
Well,
And
what-
I'm asking, and I'm a little surprised because, well, I'm not surprised because I was part of that community meeting process that you held at the different schools.
At Selby Elementary.
Right, and I got an email from someone in the city of Atherton early this year that the whole project was dropped due to lack of funding.
Well-
So I don't quite understand what you're saying.
Well, and that's pretty much what I was saying is that, again, in order, for this project, it would be a project that would be jointly funded by 3 agencies, right? Because there's 3 jurisdictional responsibilities. And none of the agencies had funding for it. So that's what I mean by there's no project.
But it was never decided what was going to happen.
Well,
It was
before,
just it was just completely dropped.
well, it wasn't completely dropped. Where we got it to was at least we identified a project that would improve the intersection safety. We identified a project that could be supported technically by 3 agencies, right? Caltrans. But in order to then take it to the next step of actual construction, well, it requires dollars. Okay, and because there were no dollars, that's why the project didn't move further. Dropped was probably the bad way of saying it. It just never did not move forward because a lack of funding. But I think that at least through this effort, and all this, by the way, was funded by the town of Atherton. All the studies, all the the community meetings were hosted by the town. So at least we got to the point of identifying improvements that didn't require a signal and that was supportable by 3 different public agencies.
Okay, okay, that's fine, but my understanding is that the city of Atherton was looking at road improvements on El Camino, starting at Valparaiso all the way up to Selby Lane. And that was a scope of the study, and that was the scope of the community meetings that were held. Okay, I got it, though.
Yeah.
So alternative 2 is the alternative that you're saying all 3 entities are in support of? Is that, or?
All 3 entities can support alternative 2,
Okay,
yes.
and does that include U-turns? I can't really tell. Will people be able to U-turn
No,
going
it-
southbound and
no.
going
We
northbound?
again, and this graphic doesn't show all the nitty-gritty details of all the signs, but no, in this case, U-turns would not, from an engineering standpoint, we would recommend that a sign posted with no U-turns.
Oh, wow, okay.
And the reason is because that just, again, introduces more conflict point. And if people want to make a U-turn, there are other places to do it. There's traffic signals very close on both sides.
Yeah, but there's no U-turns at Fifth Avenue in El Camino, so that means people would have to travel all the way down to Stockbridge in order to U-turn back up north on El Camino.
That's true, but again,
Yeah.
the whole purpose of this is to improve safety, so.
I guess I'm sorry, Council.
That's fine.
I'm having a problem because, like I said, we were in the middle of having community meetings, and you're right, it's been 3 or 4 years. For some of us in North Fair Oaks, it's been 10 years that we've been asking for the need to look at having a signal light at East Selby and El Camino. And then the city of Atherton picked up the ball, and thank you for that, and proceeded with holding community meetings. But I feel like as a participant of that process, everything was dropped. So I really think that it would be more constructive to reconvene the group that came up with some of these alternatives, just to get, just to take their pulse and make sure everyone's back on track. Because I have to tell you, a lot of people just kind of gave up on it. And I see East Selby Lane and El Camino every day, and that poor crossing guard, just goes right out in the middle of El Camino, and I just hold my breath. And I do have to say, your statistic on fatalities, there actually were 2 deaths in the last 10 years. So I don't know if your numbers are compiled with Highway Patrol and Sheriff.
When we compiled the information, with that intersection, because there's several jurisdictions, the accident reports actually have been taken by either the town of Atherton or CHP.
Okay.
Because any type of traffic accident on county roads or state highways is typically CHP.
Okay.
So we actually gathered information. We of course had the town of Atherton accident information, but then we also gathered information out of the statewide reporting system as well.
Okay. But I do strongly suggest that you reconvene, because that particular neighborhood, that's my neighborhood. And I know for a fact that that neighborhood has not looked at this for almost a year. So it makes sense to kind of get back on track and just make sure everyone, and I'm not saying come up with new alternatives, but just present it, represent it, get back on track with where things are at. At that time, last year we didn't have the support of 3, the city, the county, and the 2 cities in the county. So things have changed. So that's just my suggestion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One question I had was, is there a multi-city effort to sort of alienate all El Camino Real in a way that sort of looks alike, that you know of, or each city is independently dealing with whatever issues they have on El Camino Real?
Well, as far as El Camino Real, one of the things, and again, it's a state highway, and I know one of the things that Caltrans recently did was they actually had a pretty large project to improve pedestrian safety along El Camino Real throughout San Mateo County. And as a result of that, I'm not sure how many went in, in Redwood City and San Mateo and whatnot, but they installed a number of pedestrian hybrid beacons on El Camino Real. And what those are, the town of Atherton installed one at Almondral, and then Caltrans put 2 additional ones at Isabella and Alejandra. And I know that throughout the county of San Mateo, I think there was a total of 18 or 19. But it was a very large project where, it was an effort by Caltrans to improve, pedestrian safety and to improve the ability to cross El Camino Real.
All right.
To the chair, I have a question.
Yes, please go ahead, Rosaura.
Yeah, I have a question regarding when you said the project is stopped right now because there is no money. So there is no way to find, another alternative to get money to go to the next step in this project?
I think for this type of project, it is tough. there is grant monies available for certain types of projects. The town has applied for grants in the past to improve the intersection. Unfortunately, we were unsuccessful. But again, this is an intersection where there's two other public agencies involved as well. And so one of the challenges is getting it to be a priority for all three at the same time. I think we accomplished getting agreement from a technical solution, from all three, but to actually have it become a funding priority of all three, that's tough because every agency has competing priorities. So.
Yeah, because I think this is for the safety of everyone. I know you said there is not that many accidents, but we cannot wait until something bad can happen. Worse can be.
Right. I don't disagree with that statement.
Yeah.
In your opinion, is there anything that the North Fair Oaks Council could do to try to revive or move along this issue and perhaps have other cities taking a second look and consideration?
Well, as a council, if the council were to, send a letter to, the board, the city council, just so they know that this is something that's important to the council. At least that's a way of expressing that you're very interested in seeing something happen.
Are there any other questions from council members? Otherwise, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks. Is there any public comment on this specific issue? Otherwise, thank you. And we were going to have a third presentation tonight, but there was some miscommunication, and so the presentation in regards to the no interest loans to develop small businesses is not going to take place tonight. So hopefully we can reschedule that to a future meeting. And we will move on to reports. If we have a supervisor's report.
Good evening, council members, county council, deputy county manager, and county staff. My name is Irving Torres. I'm a senior legislative aide for Supervisor Warren Slocum, and I'll be reporting on behalf of Supervisor tonight. So one of the announcements that we wanted to make to the council members is that next month, Supervisor Slocum is going to be hosting his second community conversation, and the focus this year, or actually this theme, is mental health. So we are actually partnering up with BHRS, Behavioral Health Recovery and Services, to facilitate this dialogue. And so it's going to happen on Wednesday, October 17th, from 7 to 9. And it's going to be at the Fair Oaks Health Clinic, which is 2710 Middlefield Road. And so we have flyers on the back. And I would strongly encourage the North Fair Oaks Community Council members to please reach out to any of your neighbors or residents within the community. We definitely want to have a lot of representatives from the North Fair Oaks area come to basically get some resources. We're going to have two counselors there. And then we also have some resource tables too. So this is going to be a benefit for residents. We've just been hearing a lot of residents from North Fair Oaks asking for a need for mental health in terms of education. And so this is one of the reasons why we're having this community conversation. So that's going to happen Wednesday, October 17th. And then hopefully we'll see you there.
What time did you say it? I'm sorry?
It's going to be from 7 to 9.
7 to 9. Thank you.
And then, and we already kind of have, as of right now, probably around 43.
Oh, great.
So, which is great. And so we're hoping to have some more. And then that's all I have to report for tonight. So I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Is that going to be like a panel, Irving?
No, it's more of kind of like,
What's the format?
so the format is we're going to be offering food. So that's going to be one of the, because we do know that there's a lot of working parents. We're also going to be offering childcare, and basically we're going to have like a meal first. Then after, it's going to be BHRS. Claudia, she's going to be facilitating kind of the dialogue. So she's going to be making a presentation to educate the attendees about, you know, the topic of mental health. And she's going to be focusing on specific topics with regards to mental health, which is PTSD, depression, anxiety. I believe those are the top 3 that she's going to be focusing on. And then after that presentation, it's going to be dialogue. So, I mean, the primary purpose is we want to hear from the residents. What is it that, you know, they're being affected on with regards to mental health? It's for the supervisors to also hear from the constituents to see if there's anything that the county can do to further support them. And then also this is a way to promote BHRS's event that's happening 3 days later at St. Anthony's, the Sana event. So it's going to be a big event that Saturday. And so it's a way to, if residents are wanting to get more resources or participate in more academies, they can go to that event 3 days later. So.
Thank you very much, Irving.
All right. Thank you.
If we could have a county manager's report, please. I'm sorry?
County manager, no report out.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, go ahead.
Is the county manager's office still facilitating the NRT once a month? Okay. Can we get an update on that at some point? Not everyone's available to attend a 2 o'clock meeting.
Certainly, we can ask to put it on for next month.
Okay.
Or,
I mean, is that something that you all, did any of you go today? No. Yeah. No. Okay. Just to get some feedback on what they're doing.
okay.
Yeah, thank you.
And then we'll have council member reports. I'd like to get started.
Through the chair, if it's okay with Councilmember Lopez, I'll be happy to report the NRT meeting since I attended. So
Go ahead.
yeah, so basically we were kind of talking about the cameras that have been installed around North Fair Oaks to detect illegal dumping. So we've actually in the process of identifying a certain kind of person that had conducted illegal dumping. I believe it's near Dumbarton. And so basically the sheriff's office as well as code enforcement is going to be following up on that matter. I also mentioned to the NRT, and for those in attendance, the NRT is the neighborhood response team. And so basically it's a multi-department Public Works, Sheriff's Department, County Council that works on addressing issues in the North Fair Oaks community. And so one of the issues that we brought to the NRT was Maggie, my colleague, and I were driving around North Fair Oaks this afternoon. We identified a lot of shopping carts that were happening around North Fair Oaks. And so we've actually reached out to Lillian Clark from Office of Sustainability, and she's going to be following up on those matters as well. And so those were primarily the 2 kind of big topics that was discussed at the NRT, was kind of the camera and then the shopping carts, and then just more conversations about next steps with regards to illegal dumping.
Through the chair. Irving, on the cameras, I mean, if someone, is that facial recognition? How is someone caught?
I think it's...
Is it a license? Do they get a license plate or?
So
I was trying to figure that out, and I was hoping to make it today. I couldn't get there at 2 o'clock,
so I guess
I saw the agenda,
Yeah.
so I saw that on the agenda.
So what's interesting, and thank you, Councilmember Lopez, for that question. So what was interesting was actually, it was kind of, the illegal dumping took place in front of this property of this house. And so the camera was able to kind of catch the person kind of dumping. So that's how they were able to identify. They didn't really get to see the image, but you kind of can detect kind of the action that was happening. So, so they're going to follow up just because the cameras were rotating and so forth. So they were able to kind of just visualize that. So.
Question to the chair. And Irvin, I have a question regarding also the same thing, the cameras. But what happened when somebody drops something in front of the buildings, the commercial ones? So do they have camera? When they pick it up, the stuff, whatever they drop in there, do the sheriff view the camera of the place?
I'm sorry, could you repeat your question?
When somebody drop, something, illegal dumping in front of the building, not in front of the house, but also they review the camera videos from the buildings to see who did that?
Yeah, so I think how the cameras are placed kind of shows kind of the movements. And so I think in instances where illegal dumping has taken place in front of the cameras, depending on how the cameras are basically placed and what their functionality is. So like for this one, it was moving every kind of 15 seconds, for example, moving. And so it would be hard to detect where, like, if an illegal dumping were to happen, if, to basically track that if it came from a car or from a house. And other times it's really just hard to detect because some of them have occurred during the evening or at night. And so it's really hard to tell. I know, like, with these cameras in place for about a year or so, we haven't been really kind of identify some of these individuals that basically dumped some illegal dumping items because of just it was hard to really analyze that. And I don't think some of these cameras can really go that deep in terms of facial recognition. And I'm not sure about the question about license plates, but I'll follow up with Office of Sustainability and Code Enforcement about that question.
When you live in an apartment building and you have garbage bins, is it estimated upon the amount of apartments in that building, the size of containers you should have?
So with, and thank you, Councilmember Surya, for that question. So within the agreement, so each apartment has like a certain kind of size. So not every single apartment kind of has like those single family homes in terms of like bins and so forth. So each apartment has like a certain size of bin that is placed. And I'll have to get more information of like what's the amount of pickup in regards to these multi-unit apartment complexes.
Because what I observe many times is almost immediately after pickup day, the garbage bins become like overflowing, and you still have many days until the next pickup. So it basically starts like, overflowing. So now you're getting the garbage around the bin. And so sometimes I just wonder if another size container is needed, or like what is the solution? I don't know.
Through the chair. Irvin, do you know how many cameras are going to be installed?
I'll have to check back what's going to be the total amount of cameras being installed. I think as of right now, there's 4, but I'll have to double check. I'll have to talk to Code Enforcement as well as the Office of Sustainability.
Irving, I just have one more question about the cameras. Well, it's a comment. I think that I know the cameras were initially brought into North Fair Oaks for the purpose of identifying illegal dumping. I want to know, though, is that the only, I want to make sure that the cameras are, the parameter of use is illegal dumping. And I don't know how that's written up or if there's I don't know. But I just, that's my own personal opinion is I don't want to see too many cameras all over. I think that I want to assure people that they still get their privacy, acknowledged. And I understand, though, I understand the need for another tool to help identify illegal dumping. I understand that. But with the cameras that are set up, and if there's going to be more set up, I want to make sure that the parameter of use is strictly for identifying illegal dumping. I just don't want to open the door for letting those cameras be used for whatever. That's it. And I don't know how you do that. I guess something's written up, but that's just something I was thinking about.
Sure, and thank you so much for that comment, Councilmember Lopez. I know originally when this installation of the cameras were first in place, it was one to identify, well, basically there's hotspot areas of huge illegal dumping in North Fair Oaks. And so that was the purpose of the cameras. And I know one of the discussions that was raised was that kind of comment that you referred to about, making sure that we're keeping the privacy. And so those were some of the conversations. I will have to talk to basically the ones that are managing the cameras about the policy in place. And on side note, I know there's conversations about kind of looking at our county ordinance about kind of that issue. I know Santa Clara County has a surveillance ordinance, and so those are discussions that are being held at the moment right now. And so, but those are questions, good comments to be raised, and I know I'll have to talk to the code enforcement and the ones that manage the cameras about if there's a policy in place. So, and just on an additional note, the cameras have actually also helped our law enforcement as well. And so in those areas, it has also been helpful for our law enforcement in regards to safety as well. So there's been some kind of instances in the past, and it's actually helped the sheriff's office with regards to following up some of those instances. So.
Thank you very much, Irving.
All right, thank you.
Proceeding with council members' reports, if any council member has a report. First, I'd like to again welcome Jennifer and Francis. I know that it's difficult to join in running, but my understanding is that in November we will have a session with the Brown Act and a couple of other components to get you up to speed in some of the norms for the council member meetings. And so if you have any questions, reach out, to myself or to any of the other members, to council, county council, or the team from the county. And by all means, any questions you may have about procedures or anything else, let us know. And welcome and thank you for your service. They not
That'll
yet.
happen next month.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I'll try to coordinate with Mitzi and Emma in that regard. Thanks very much. Anybody else has anything else? Okay. And that then we'll just adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much, everybody.